It's now my pleasure to talk and to introduce Frank Hanna III, who many of you know here as just a serial entrepreneur. He is the president and the chairman of Hanna Capital, but he is speaking to us today about something else which he is also very, very familiar with, and that is, of course, Catholic education. Mr. Hanna has started 3 different schools in the Atlanta area. He's on the board of 2 schools in the Atlanta area. But most importantly, he has spoken widely about faith-based education, Catholic education, virtue-based education, and of course has spoken widely too on free enterprise and the virtues of free enterprise. What he's going to speak to us today about is, I think, very important. He's going to talk to us about a rival philosophy of education, one that is contrary to the kind of Catholic education that Father Barron was just talking about, one, as he says, with its own saints, its own militancy, its own philosophy, and one that, of course, is very tempting to our own culture. So it is with great pride and honor that we welcome Mr. Frank Hanna, who is, of course, a member of the Napa Institute Board, to the stage to help us meet that challenge of the new secularism. Mr. Hanna?
Thank you, Father. It is wonderful to be with so many good friends out there, in particular Father Robert Barron, who is a friend, and he talked about golf. We actually first met on a golf outing. And I thought Tim Bush was a friend until I found out that he schedules before me a guy who's a professional, who's a media star, who's a professor, who's a historical expert. And then Tim says, yeah, my business guy, Frank, can follow him. So, but it's not a competition. So until this afternoon, Father and I are playing golf. So, Father, I'm throwing down the gauntlet now. Whether you're already a friend or soon to be a friend, and I hope those of you I don't know are soon to be friends, I don't want to waste your time this morning. We've all heard many wonderful things about how great Catholic schools are. And we've all heard how they're declining. And we've all heard how we simply must do something. Now, this talk is, where do we go from here with Catholic education? And Father and I got our lines crossed, I guess, a little bit, because I'm not exactly speaking about what he referenced. I'm speaking about Catholic education, and I'm going to speak to you as an entrepreneur who's analyzing it, who's been involved in it for a long time. I, too, think Catholic schools can be great, and I, too, am concerned about their decline, and I, too, think we simply must do something. But it's time to advance that dialogue. Actually, it's been more of a monologue, and it's time to get creative. I want to start a dialogue, a challenging exchange of ideas. Because we've been doing this monologue for about 25 years, and with a few particularly notable exceptions around the country, with a few exceptions, and some of you are involved in some of the exceptions. But in general, we're still taking on water. At some point, rearranging chairs on the deck of the Titanic is not just a waste of time, but it draws us away from either fixing the leak in the boat or getting on the lifeboats. Unfortunately, advancing the dialogue sometimes means we might create controversy. It's the nature of any institution, particularly of the individuals within that institution, to become defensive when criticized, especially when the intentions of both the institution and the individual are good. We have a lot of very good and dedicated people devoted to Catholic education. How dare we criticize it? And within our church, because we face so much criticism from the outside world, why, oh why, would we want to criticize ourselves? But we all know an examination of conscience is a healthy thing. Not only is it healthy, it's a critical component of our lives as Christians. And so let's embark on an examination of conscience as it pertains to Catholic education. And let us seek to make resolutions not just to do something, but to do those things that must be done if we're to be true to our mission as the Church of Jesus Christ. So let me tell you what I want to go over this morning. First, I want to put this issue in the proper context. I'll do this by briefly describing the good and the bad of our current circumstances. Second, I'm going to provide you a diagnosis of the problem. This part should provoke you. It's not going to be pleasant. Together, we're going to look into the bright light of what's been taking place under our watch, and that part is going to hurt a little bit. It'd be like coming out of a theater in the middle of the day into the outdoor sun and not being able to squint, and the light hits your eye, and it might not permanently blind you, but it's very uncomfortable. So I apologize ahead of time for that. Third, I want to tell you what I think we need to do to fix it. Now, before I start, a few caveats. Just who do I think I am coming in and making these pronouncements? Well, I'm nothing but a summation of my experiences and some good faith analysis and my fervent belief in our church and the necessity of this cause. I do intend to be provocative this morning. In other words, I want to provoke you. And I want you to provoke others, but always with charity. Let's think of this as a charitable provocation. I mentioned a summation of my experiences here and abroad, and Father touched on them. I just want to give you a little bit of background. For 3 decades, I've worked side by side with cardinals, bishops, priests, religious superiors, religious brothers and sisters, businessmen and women, superintendents, principals, teachers, parents, legislators, governors, judges, and even the President of the United States to find ways to keep more Catholic schools open or from closing and to start and open more. I've been involved in the founding and opening of 8 different Catholic educational institutions. Some have succeeded, some have not. And Father mentioned I've spoken at conferences and hosted conferences and written legislation, financed Supreme Court cases, served on boards, headed up task forces. I'm not trying, this is my calling, and I'm grateful for that. I'm giving you that as a summation of experiences. I've been around the block a little bit, and the data I have at my disposal is not a trivial amount. My day job for the last 24 years has been in venture capital and private equity. Essentially, we make money if we can accurately observe, project, and manage results. And we lose money if we don't. That day job has honed a set of skills that's not without some transferability when it comes to looking at nonprofits and their effectiveness, especially things like Catholic education. So I analyze it as an entrepreneur and an investor. And I mentioned we're going to start with some context. Here's context for the problem we're discussing this morning. This is, I think, the place in which we should put Catholic education as we think about it. First, a secular observation. Actually, first, let's do a biological observation. Biologically, the first thing we must do as a species is perpetuate the species. As humans, we do this by procreating. And then we teach our offspring those things which evolution has demanded. In other words, humans have evolved to the point where instincts alone are not enough for them to optimize the condition of their species. So they teach one another. From a secular standpoint, the most important thing we do as a civilization, is to raise our children well, because otherwise the civilization ends. Oddly enough, it's one of the things that in our current society, because of its fragmentation and despite its sophistication, oddly enough, this generation does it worse than previous generations. I'm not going to go further down that particular road right now, but we all know examples of it. From a Catholic standpoint, the most fundamental thing we do after the sacraments is the passing on of our faith. If we fail to do this, our species will decline. That is not an opinion. Jesus himself made clear. He gave to the apostles and their successors, our bishops, a singular commandment: go forth and teach all the nations. Many of you know the word education comes from the Latin words to be led. Catholic education is, simply put, the process of leading someone toward Jesus Christ. An education that does not lead to Christ is not a Catholic education. And an institution that does not provide that type of education is not a Catholic school. And unfortunately, we are failing in our fundamental mission as a church. Y'all know the numbers. In the early 60s, Catholic schools were educating 5.2 million children per year. Today, we have 2 million children in Catholic schools. But it's worse than that, because back then the Catholic population was 45 million, and today it's 70 or 75 million. So we went, at any particular time back in 65, 1 out of every 9 Catholics was in a Catholic school. And today, 1 out of every 35 Catholics is in a Catholic school. Granted, the percentage of children in the population has declined a little bit, but that's still a shocking drop. In Atlanta and many cities, less than 10% of our Catholic children are learning their faith in a Catholic school. One truism and one caveat here. First, the truism. Catholic education for the church is not an option. It's the very nature of evangelization to teach others about God. That's what Jesus did. That's what he told his apostles to do. Now the caveat. Catholic schools, on the other hand, are merely one means of delivering that education, that formation. We all know that the church teaches that parents are the primary educators of their children and that the home is the domestic church. So I'm taking as a premise that at this moment in time, in the church here in the United States, Catholic schools are currently the most efficacious method to provide a Catholic education to meet the needs of most of our children. But toward the end of this talk, I also want to talk about non-traditional means of delivering Catholic education, because we can't let that ship of innovation sail by us. And as context, we've seen Catholic education work, and when it does, it's beautiful. It's sublime. It takes a young person out of their animal instincts, and it teaches them they were created in God's image and given a soul that's eternal. In the end, Catholic education teaches them how to be happy, for it opens their eyes to truth, beauty, and goodness. And it's an immeasurable treasure that they carry with them for the rest of their lives and into eternity. So that's our context. Now on to what's gone wrong, the painful part. Here's a fact. We Catholics do not believe in Catholic education. If by believing we mean there is something for which we will make the necessary sacrifice to keep it alive, we do not believe in Catholic education as a whole. Lay people don't, priests don't, and bishops don't. When we did believe in it, we made it happen. We used to view Catholic education as a necessity. Now we view it as a luxury. Allow me to give you a historical example to make my point. Let's look at the creation of Catholic schools briefly in America just before the Civil War, and their explosive growth in the years thereafter. In particular, let's look at Bishop John Hughes and his prodigious success in New York. He was a bishop for 26 years, from 1838 until 1864. From his earliest years, Bishop Hughes had been wary of free public education for Catholics. Many of the first publicly funded school systems sought explicitly to inculcate in students a Protestant worldview. Some, such as the New York school system, run by the Public Schools Society, were actually blatant anti-Catholic. About these anti-Catholic public school systems, the Vicar General of the diocese at that point said, "How can we think of sending our children to schools in which every artifice will be resorted in order to reduce them from their religion?" By the way, our public schools are no less hostile to our Catholic faith today than they were then. After a brutal 2-year political battle in the early 1840s, Bishop Hughes convinced New York to take control of the public schools away from the anti-Catholic Public School Society. Unfortunately, the government did that and then replaced those schools with a new school system that banned any form of religious education. And that was a change that many other states soon adopted. So Catholics seeking free education for their children were left with schools that explicitly and completely excluded from their curriculum not only Catholicism, but all Christianity. And one Catholic pamphlet at the time argued, one of the first practical dangers is that the greatest truths that bear on human life shall come to be identified with Sunday and churches and Sunday school. What is this but a lesson in the practical atheism that shuts God out of all but certain selected parts of life to do as he pleases? What would be the effect on a child's mind of excluding studiously all mention of his earthly father from his work and play for 5 or 6 days of the week, treating all his belongings and relations without reference to parents to whom he owes them, and permitting such reference only at those times when it was declared in order? Formerly, Catholics sending their children to the aggressively Protestant public schools risked having their children leave the faith. Now Catholics sending their children to public schools risk having them leave Christianity. Does that sound familiar? When we think about our public schools, our bishops at that point confronted a grim prospect. And realizing the gravity of the problem, Bishop Hughes insisted to all who would listen And this is his quote. In our age, the question of education is the question of the church. Further, he declared, the time has come when we all shall have to build the schoolhouse first and the church afterward. Actually, he said the time has almost come. He understood we had to do the sacraments first. But he was making that point of how critical the school is. Are any of our dioceses acting like Bishop Hughes acted in New York at that time? I actually do see some courageous experimentation taking place. But as a whole, we're not doing that. And that's a comment about all of us, not just our bishops. That's a comment about all of us. Having failed to find in the public schools an acceptable place for young Catholics, Archbishop Hughes turned his back on the public schools, and for 25 years, he established over 50 educational institutions, elementary schools, high schools, industrial schools, art academies, colleges, and seminaries, and even universities. And inspired by his example, other bishops started sharing with, and they got to unanimity of conviction that the secular public school systems would erode the faith of young Catholics. And other bishops followed suit, creating across America in just a few decades, in social, financial, and political times that were actually more precarious than ours. And yet they created a mighty educational fleet of thousands of Catholic schools that afforded good Catholic parents, they could send their children to these schools, secure in the knowledge that these children would be properly catechized in the faith. And by 1900, tens of thousands were pouring forth from the doors of these schools. They became lifelong Catholics, and they gave birth to a generation that produced thousands of priests who shored up and deepened the church. And the commitment went beyond building the schools in ever-increasing numbers and with greater unity of purpose. The Catholic community promoted Catholic education. Relentlessly, bishops, priests, and religious wielded all the tools at their disposal. Classroom, confessional, chancery, pulpit. They reminded the faithful, young and old, of the deficiencies of non-Catholic religions and the necessity of our Catholic faith and its sacraments. They hammered home the obligation of parents to provide their children a solid Catholic education. And they pressed parents to ensure that it was done properly by sending them to Catholic school. In 1852, the First Plenary Council of Baltimore urged every Catholic parish in the nation to establish a school. In 1866, the Second Plenary Council repeated that call. In 1884, they weren't satisfied. And so the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore turned the plea into a command, mandating that within 2 years, every parish have its own Catholic school, and that all Catholic parents send their children to them. Catholics who, without good and sufficient reasons, failed to comply with this directive were under risk of punishment, and pastors had to worry about being demoted. By 1900, what had, in Bishop Hughes' time, been initially considered kind of a hardline minority position was accepted wisdom in Catholic circles. It was said the parish school system, with all its defects and shortcomings, is indispensable for the preservation of the Catholic religion in the hearts of Catholic children. They said it's the nursery of the faith for the rising generation. Now, as we review history, and this is the part where it gets uncomfortable, we have to come to one of the following conclusions, I think. Either Bishop Hughes and his fellow bishops and the Baltimore Plenary Council were wrong, or the earlier bishops were right, but public schools had become much more accommodating of Christianity, and the Catholic Church and therefore Catholic schools are no longer necessary. Or our parents are much better catechized today and truly know their faith and are taking the time to teach their children the faith. Or all of our children go to CCD, and CCD can now accomplish in 1 hour a week what used to require complete immersion in a Catholic environment. Or we, the bishops, priests, religious, and laity of today's church, are either subconsciously making those assumptions, turning a blind eye to the facts, or abandoning our belief that Catholic education is necessary. But in any of those last cases, we're wrong. I think we're wrong. But when I say wrong, what do I mean? I mean essentially that while we may say we believe in Catholic education, we don't. Because we don't do the things that true believers would do if they really believed. So at this point, I may not have convinced you, but you might be willing to say, fine, Frank. It's hard, though. If you were Pope, what would you do? And I'm glad you asked. But I'm not going to play the what if you were Pope game. I will tell you what I would tell him if he came to me and asked me and said, we don't seem to be making adequate progress in this task. Based on what you've seen, what do you think we should do? In other words, how do we fix it? And I'd say, Holy Father, I'm a businessman and a steward. And I spent 25 years investing in both for-profit and non-profit enterprises. And there are some commonalities in those which are successful. And it's not complex to be successful, but it's difficult, kind of like holiness. And here's what successful enterprises do. And by the way, this is what our church did regarding Catholic education 150 years ago. But this is not what we do today. I'm going to list them quickly, and then I'll go through them slowly and explain them in a minute. But quickly, first, they define their mission. Second, they set definite priorities. Third, they avoid anything which takes them away from their priorities. Fourth, they maintain a high level of quality for their priorities. Fifth, they constantly assess and reassess, in other words, measure their progress on those priorities. And finally, they evangelize, i.e., they market their priorities. Every successful business I've seen does those things. Every successful nonprofit enterprise I've seen does those things. Jesus was the best marketer of all time, so we need to think of marketing in a good way. Today in our church, when it comes to Catholic education, we don't really do any of those 6 things very well. Any of them. So let's go through them quickly here, one at a time, those 6. First, we must define our mission. Our mission as a church is to spread the good news of Jesus Christ. Anything that does not further this endeavor is not part of our mission. That does not mean that other things are bad. It's just not part of our mission as the church. We need to consider the teachings of the church and ask ourselves how much we really believe in Catholic education. We need to ask ourselves, is this something that ranks second only to the provision of the sacraments? If we don't believe that, if we don't determine that it's the greatest importance, well, you could almost stop troubling about the state of Catholic education and close them down and use the resources we have to work on other good things. There are other good things out there. But if after reflection and prayer we find that we do believe, as did Bishop Hughes and his colleagues, that in our day the question of education is the question of the church, then we've got to move to the second step. And the second step is to set priorities. Interiorly, we must commit ourselves single-mindedly toward Catholic education. When I say priorities, I don't mean like you make a Christmas list. You say, I'd like this, I'd like this, I'd like this. No, I mean deciding which 1 or 2 or 3 things are most important and not getting distracted by other things until we've done all that we can on those priorities. We've all heard people tell us that they can't find time to make it to Mass every week. Okay? And we know it's not a matter of finding the time. You make the time. If it's a priority and it's physically possible, then it'll happen. So when I speak of renewing our Catholic schools, I'm not talking about something that I think is physically impossible. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. It's true that education costs more today because we no longer have the inexpensive labor we had in the form of priests and religious that we used to have. But as a Catholic population, we are so much more wealthy than we were in the past, as a population. So if we were to make Catholic education a priority, what would that entail? It's going to be tough. Setting priorities is like balancing a budget. Something's got to go. Something we're working on and spending on has got to go. And so what I think we have to say as a church is, there may be thousands of good things we do as a church, but within the formal church, and I say that now because all of us as lay people are part of the body of Christ and the church, and we're doing things in our own family. But as the formal church, our first priority is to offer sacraments to the faithful, and right after sacramental priority is the priority to feed our children the faith. And we kind of have to say that and believe that if we're going to move forward. And until we're satisfactorily feeding our children the faith, I don't think we should really be spending money and time on other things. We've seen that the educational successes of our early bishops came from kind of this focused commitment to Catholic formation. And we have to be equally courageous and determined. I think we have to ask ourselves, our bishops have to ask themselves, as bishop, am I willing to make a commitment as radical as that of the earlier bishops to guarantee my flock the Catholic formation that I need to provide to them, and to fix or abandon things that aren't working? That abandoning things that aren't working is really hard for any of us in any business, in any family, in any diocese. And so the third principle, after we define our mission and we set our priorities, is to go about the hard process of disengaging from everything that does not directly support our priorities. And I think we have to carefully and thoroughly review all diocesan endeavors and step back as quickly and prudently as possible from all that do not directly serve the one obligation that is fundamentally and uniquely ours, the formation of Catholics. Until we're feeding our children, what in the world are we doing spending money on things other than food for them? Bishops are in the business, if I may use that term, business, of administering the sacraments and providing Catholic formation to souls. And we as laity are in the business of supporting them in every way we can to do that. Jesus himself made it clear. He told us to love our neighbor, feed the hungry, comfort the afflicted, visit the sick. He gave the apostles and their successors a particular commandment: go forth and teach all nations. So whereas well-formed Catholics in all states of life, all lay people out there, and non-laity, can with competence and even with authority build legal service providers and hospitals and soup kitchens and establish scores of other ministries that operate in accordance with the truths of our faith. Only bishops have the authority to determine which teachings are authentically Catholic and which are not. They alone are charged with ensuring that authentic Catholic teachings reach the ears and touch the hearts of men and women. And I realize the role of parents there, and I don't want to get into that theological distinction, but at the end of the day, that's really the role of the formal church. And let's go one step further and say foremost among the souls that we have to form are our young people, our children. So we got a particular obligation to them. Hospitals and soup kitchens and homeless shelters and immigrant assistance and legal services are good and important and wonderful services, but not if they take the spiritual food out of the mouths of our children. There's a charming statement that I've heard over the years repeated time after time regarding our Catholic schools, and particularly regarding our Catholic schools that serve non-Catholic students. And I apologize if this is going to be offensive. The saying won't be offensive. What I have to say about it is, the saying is that we educate these children not because they are Catholic, but because we are. And that's a charming comment. These non-Catholic students in these schools we run, we educate them not because they're Catholic, but because we are. But what if I turned it on its head, that saying, and said, actually, we educate these children not because they are Catholic, but because we started this school 50 years ago to feed our own children the faith. And as they grew up, they and their children moved out to the suburbs. And we don't know how to manage building new schools in the suburbs, especially if we keep subsidizing the schools that don't have Catholic children. And we get a lot of good publicity for educating these non-Catholic children. And if we shut down the school, we might look heartless. And so even though we know that our own children in the suburbs are having their families resigned to putting their children in the public schools, we ask them to subsidize our social project and fool ourselves into thinking that if they go to CCD, they'll learn the faith. Now, that statement's not quite as charming, but that's what's happened. We take up collections from Catholics in the pews who have no Catholic school for their children so that we can run schools for children who are not Catholic and whose parents often have no desire for them to be Catholic. Now, this is not an us versus them, but at the end of the day, that's what's happening, and our own children are starving. We're not providing our Catholic food for our children. So as we hone in on our priority, number 4, we must concurrently, and this is the part about managing the quality of your priority, we got to restore integrity to the Catholic school brand. And this part's hard too. But if we're serious about success, we must immediately fix or shut down any of our schools that fail to send forth into the world well-formed Catholic young people. Let me give you a disturbing theory. That theory, and I came to this late after being confused by parents and frustrated. The theory is that many parents who are choosing not to sacrifice to send their children to Catholic schools might be acting prudently. That's a theory. Here's a fact. And I'll pick an example based in my hometown, the Coca-Cola Company. It has one of the strongest brands in history. Coca-Cola is known all over the world. And one of the reasons its brand is so strong is that we all know that no matter where we go, with very little difference, the Coca-Cola we pay for will taste the same. The Coca-Cola Company is valued at close to $175 billion. And most of that value is in the value of their brand. If I wanted to destroy the Coca-Cola Company, there's only one thing I'd need to do. If somehow I could figure out a way to take out the fizz, the carbonation, in a quarter of those Cokes, in 1/4 of them, I don't have to ruin all of them. Just take out enough of the fizz that when you go buy a Coke, you're uncertain as to what you're going to get. I've now destroyed the assurance you have with the Coca-Cola brand. No one wants a flat Coke. And if you get one on more than isolated occasions, you'll just stop buying Coke. I think you know where I'm going with this. Our brand is gravely injured. When a study just a few years ago showed that 2/3 of the religious textbooks used in our Catholic schools were deficient, you got to be kidding me. Imagine that 2/3 of the Cokes were flat. I mean, that's a complete disaster. It's no secret that many devout Catholic parents don't send their kids to available Catholic schools for fear of the scandal that will come about when the faith is taught poorly, not at all, or worse, when dissent is either encouraged or tolerated. If we the laity, are allowing a Catholic school in our diocese to operate when it's not doing what a Catholic school is supposed to do, we're destroying the brand. We, the priests and the bishops, are destroying the brand. It's great if we have humanitarian results from Catholic education, but it's not primarily a social service. Why in the world, if you are a parent in the suburbs, would you make the incredible financial sacrifice you must make when you're not sure if you're going to get flat Coke? Understand this, we talk about doing a better academic job than the public schools, and we do. That advantage is much greater in the inner city. In the suburbs, it's tougher. We usually do a little bit better. Against the private academies, we don't necessarily do that much better in academics. What we do better is in faith formation, but we got to offer it, we got to do it, or we have no competitive advantage, and we'll lose, as we have been losing. So that's the management of the brand. Fifth, once we've established our mission, set our priority, focused on our priority, and concentrated on our quality, our brand management, we must assess and reassess our progress. We got to measure it. And what should we be measuring? We all know in any endeavor, if you don't measure it, you tend not to have accountability. We should be measuring the degree to which a Catholic school leads children and their parents to Christ. By the way, I know that's hard. How do you measure that? You know, you're trying to measure a non-quantifiable thing, but, the church has done that forever. When we say Blessed John Paul II was holy, we're implicitly saying that while all human beings quantifiably have some goodness in them and some evil in them, John Paul II had so much good in him, and the original sin in him was so overcome and so diminished that we dare to say he's reached a measurable threshold of goodness that we call holiness. I mean, it's a measurement of goodness once we say saint or blessed so-and-so. In our Catholic school systems, I think we've got things a little bit backwards. We measure the wrong things. We ridicule the bureaucracy of the public school systems, and then we build our own bureaucracies in our own diocese. We can't view every Catholic school in every neighborhood as needing the exact same approach. We got to encourage experimentation. The one thing we should measure among all of them and insist upon is the faith formation of the children and their parents. But I say it backwards because we tend to make everything, we measure other things, right? And the one thing we're supposed to be measuring to make sure we have quality and make sure we can kind of put our brand on, the one thing we ought to be measuring, we're not measuring. We develop metrics for financial and sometimes academic stuff, and that stuff is good. But more importantly, we got to develop measurements, and there are things you can look at to look at the faith formation. Human beings respond to measurement and accountability, and they also respond to no measurement and no accountability. We measure to ensure quality, because if we can't ensure quality, we won't have any customers, and it'll get even worse than what we find ourselves in today. Finally, as we achieve the previous goals, we go out and aggressively market our reformed Catholic education. The good bishops who built our first Catholic schools believed that in season and out, America's priests and religious should join them in using all the tools at their disposal: classroom, confessional, pulpit, chancery, all the things they had to remind the faithful, young and old, of the necessity of our Catholic faith and its sacraments. Further, they believed those same priests and religious should join them in reminding parents every opportunity possible of their solemn obligation to send their children to Catholic schools. I told you all about what the Baltimore Plenary Council did and how hardcore they were. Now, that may not be to our taste exactly the way the language of the 1884 Baltimore Plenary Council came out with that. But let's not let that language blind us to the key point it illuminates. Stern decrees that were given by the bishops were rooted in confidence in Catholic education. Our bishops and priests and the lay people had confidence and followed them. I'm 50 years old. Let's assume I started paying attention to homilies when I was about 10, kind of. Through the grace of God, I've only missed a few Sundays over the last 40 years. So let's assume I've heard about 2,000, not counting daily homilies, that's a different thing, but about 2,000 weekly homilies. I've heard a priest speak in 2,000 homilies, I've heard a priest speak from the pulpit about the need for parents to have their children educated in Catholic schools less than 5 times in 2,000 homilies. In the same 40 years of homilies, I've never heard even one homily that even referenced and mentioned the word duty in the same sentence with parents and what they owed to their children. We don't, in fact, truly market our schools, i.e. convince folks of the need for them. Here's another fact. Most Catholic parents of school-aged children, they don't really know what we mean by Catholic education. And they don't really see a great need for their children to receive it. That hurts. I mean, that hurts me. I've worked in this stuff for a long time. That hurts me to think about that. But at some point, you're beating your head against the wall, and you have to say, well, what's going on here? Well, they don't think they need it. And so many who can afford Catholic education choose not to pursue it, and many who do not have school-aged children but have the resources to support Catholic education choose not to support it. In light of the financial burdens of tuition, we're hesitant. Our priests are hesitant to encourage parents to send their kids, but that caution has transformed into timidity that intimates in the end that we don't really have anything to say about whether or not children ought to get Catholic education. Let me repeat one of the statements I just made more starkly. Parents have no conception of what a Catholic education is. They are astonishingly uncatechized. And so here's my conclusion, and in my conclusion, I'm sorry, I'm rubbing my eyes, I'm having eye trouble. In my conclusion, I've discussed principles, 6 principles, and I want to give you some specific, challenging, thought-provoking tactics that we might have in following those principles. I realize some of you may disagree with some of them or all of them. And there's not really a priority to these things. But like I said, this is charitable provocation. So starting with quality, we should replace all principals, religion teachers, and school leaders who are not practicing Catholics in our schools. Okay? We should ask those who remain to sign something along the lines of a mandatum, wherein they would acknowledge the mission of the church, the school, and an affirmation that they're in accord with that mission. Bishop Vasha had something that he had drafted a while back for the folks working in his chancery in Oregon that was really wonderful. But that type of thing, I mean, who would object in a corporation and say, no, I don't believe in Coca-Cola. I drink Pepsi and I hate Coke. I mean, what we should have each school have a clear mission statement for its own school, which mission statement should be approved by the bishop. We should develop metrics for our schools with the primary metric related to the degree to which the school is leading the students and their parents to a knowledge and practice of the Catholic faith. By the way, you hear me say leading parents. One of the beautiful things I've seen about Catholic education is you're not just teaching the kids. The number of parents I've seen who come to confession after 20 years because their kid's going through their first confession. You bring whole families. That's one of the hidden secrets that nobody talks about a lot, but it's beautiful. Any schools which don't meet this standard of bringing people to the faith should, after a probationary period, be closed. And any money spent subsidizing that school should go back into the budget to help the other schools. Just imagine if we closed a school not for financial reasons, but because it was not fulfilling its mission. Does anyone know of this happening anywhere in the country in the past 50 years? If you do, come up to me afterwards, because I haven't seen that happen. And I got to think a few are not hitting the mark. We should have the primary role of the diocese be that of accreditation. And by accreditation, I mean saying this is authentic. We have looked at this. You can trust in it. Accreditation and financial assistance. Next, we should close down CCD and instead focus on much more intensive sacramental preparation that involves both the students and their parents. Right now, most of our sacramental preparation is woeful. Until it's improved, we should abandon CCD and substitute something that's much better. The better thing, I think, is to devote significant resources to this sacramental preparation. Now, as a business guy, I'm thinking of markets, right? There are a few times when people really come to the church for something specific other than just Mass. They come for baptism, they come for First Communion, they come for confirmation, they come for marriage. I mean, that's our low-hanging fruit. And we're missing a golden opportunity for Catholic formation. If we took all the energy for CCD and just said, let's just focus on those areas. Let's just really teach people about those sacraments when they come. Until we reinvigorate our Catholic school system, which could take a number of years, that sacramental preparation would be about the only Catholic education most of our children will receive. And by the way, and this is really critical, sacramental preparation may be the most important component of a Catholic education. Here's what Pope Benedict said recently about it. He said, Eucharistic and sacramental catechesis must really go to the depth of our existence. To be, in fact, education to open myself to the voice of God, to let myself be open to break this original sin of egoism and to open my existence profoundly. That's what he said about sacramental preparation. We should put more resources into adult Catholic education. If our adults don't know the faith, they can't teach it to their children. And let me tell you, we younger folks, 50 and 50 is now young, meaning 50 and below, we did not grow up with the Baltimore Catechism, and most of us are horribly ignorant of our faith, even if we go to Mass every Sunday. Next, we should reorient our diocesan budgets. We should work toward a budget that supports the administration of the sacraments and affordable Catholic education for all who desire it, and only fund additional diocesan projects after these priorities are met. Next, rather than subsidize individual schools, we should have a big portion of the diocesan budget devoted to tuition vouchers, Catholic tuition vouchers, for parents who financially qualify for them, and then let them use those vouchers at any Catholic school around. And we tell the state that's what they ought to do, okay? But then we force all of our Catholic kids into some schools that are bad or not as good. Let them choose. Let them choose. And that prompts the other Catholic schools. I've seen in our diocese when we had, one school was doing challenging, innovative things, and then the other Catholic school said, ooh, wow, look what they're doing. And we're following behind. We lost some students to them. Boom, we got to change. I mean, it works in the church, too. We should encourage our schools to experiment with technology and other innovations, as long as they abide by our diocesan standards, particularly regarding faith formation. We should hail their entrepreneurial experiments rather than view them as a threat. We should spiritually and financially encourage parents who are interested in other forms of Catholic education. Those other forms would include homeschooling, group homeschooling, hybrid schools that incorporate homeschooling and traditional schooling, after-school clubs that are focused on formation in the faith, Again, as long as these entities meet our diocesan standards for faith formation, we should encourage them and provide vouchers for their expenses. Many of these unconventional methods may contain within them the keys to the reinvigoration of our Catholic school system. And again, if we can say to the state, look, we save you money by educating kids in our Catholic schools. We should have vouchers to help us because we're saving you money. Well, shouldn't parents who gather together and teach the kids the faith and do the job that otherwise our Catholic schools would do, shouldn't they maybe get a voucher from the diocese if they're financially needy because they're doing our job for us and saving us money at the diocesan level? I mean, if the argument works here, it works here. It's kind of a radical notion. And I'm not proposing if people aren't financially needy, they get it. But if people are actually doing the job, and there's not a Catholic school around, shouldn't we consider whether we financially support these parents over here who are struggling to figure out some new model to educate their kids? But we don't do that right now. We should continue to pressure governmental bodies for tuition vouchers and credits for our religious schools. By the way, after 30 years of struggle, we're actually making a little bit of headway in that area. So I think we need to do that. We should ask our bishops to inform parents of their obligation to have their children educated in the faith. We should ask our bishop to have his priest speak twice a year to these parishioners about the obligation to have their children instructed in the faith. And that doesn't always mean a Catholic school, but they have the obligation. And if they don't hear it, they don't know it. If they don't know it, they won't do it, in all likelihood, unless they stumble upon it. We should create diocesan-wide tithing campaigns and insist that our priests have a tithing campaign for their parishioners. We should explain that we're collecting this money in order to provide for the sacraments and to educate our children, and say to them that before they give money to other charities, they should first consider the claim that's on them to continue to educate and feed our own children. Before you support something else, why are you supporting something else when our own children are going hungry? We have daunting conditions in front of us. This stuff's tough. But, the challenges are no more daunting than they were 150 years ago. Every age has its challenges. I think we can meet them. It's not that complicated. The stuff I've said today is not rocket science. It's kind of common sense and just observing the data. But it is hard. We've got to define our mission, set our priorities, jettison those things which are not priorities, insist on quality, reform our diocesan tuition and management models, and then evangelize. Every suggestion I made today is achievable. Most of them have been done in some place or at some point in history. Now, we don't have to do any of these things. We could just keep doing the same things we've been doing for the last 25 years, hoping for a different result. Santayana called that the definition of insanity. And I want you to understand, when I say these things, and some of them may sound a little bit radical, don't throw them out thinking it's all or nothing. It's not all or nothing. It's can we move toward that? I think the things I've thrown out, and particularly the suggestions toward the end, and some of you may have other suggestions, and remember, it's a dialogue. We got to get that dialogue going. I think we have to say, of these things I mentioned, if we could do them, would we want to? If we could do that, because right now we say, you can't do that, can't do that, can't do that. Okay, if we could, would we want to? And if the answer is, well, yeah, if we could, we'd want to. Well, if we want to, then how do we start making that happen? Ours is an age that requires courage and fortitude. It's a job for all of us. We need to make our case, craft solutions, and encourage our bishops to proceed with them. I don't consider my remarks today the final word. I lay these points before you in the hope that we may learn from them, draw strength from that which strength can be drawn from, and forge a new approach. I want to end with my hero here. Back in May 1998, in speaking to certain bishops in an ad limina address, John Paul the Great said the following, quote, "As the Second Vatican Council emphasized, the Catholic school aims to create for the school community an atmosphere enlivened by the gospel spirit of freedom and charity. It aims to help the young person in such a way that the development of his or her own personality will be matched by the growth of that new creation which he or she has become by baptism. It strives to relate all human culture eventually to the news of salvation, so that the light of faith will illumine the knowledge which students gradually gain of the world of life and of the human family." He said the mission of the Catholic Church is the integral formation of students so that they may be true to their condition as Christ's disciples, and as such work effectively for the evangelization of our culture and the common good of society. We've all seen Catholic education work. It does make a difference. Our children learn that they have dignity and a transcendent vocation. They learn Gloria Dei Homo Vivens Est. Did I get that right? Okay, almost. We have the best educational product in the world. We have the truth. But we must be bolder than we have been in the last 25 years. We must be bolder. We must be more courageous. Let's entrust this time we have together as we go forward to the Theotokos, our mother in heaven, that person, that woman who bore Christ to us. Because as we work together on the Theotokos project, we seek to bear Christ to our children. And so let us ask her for her particular care and intercession for this. I think it's something we absolutely must have to do. And it's something that's incumbent on us. I'm grateful to all of you for all the work you do in this area. But let us pray together and work together and be bold together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Frank. Wow, that was an incredible challenge to all of us, but with real practical steps to help us to get underway. Just thinking about those 6 steps of defining our mission and focusing, or defining our priorities and then focusing on those priorities. And above all, trying to work on the quality of our message and our brand, and then that measurement, and of course, at the end of the day, the aggressive marketing and evangelization. The one thought that just kept occurring to me as I was listening to that, and that incredibly good advice on how to get started, was we all too need one more thing: a heart and a soul for that transcendent vocation, and for that, deep and abiding, grounding in the resurrection of Christ and in the God who is truly the infinite God of being that was mentioned by both Father Barron and Frank. That heart and soul is what's so necessary, and of course so exemplified in Frank's, Hannah's talk, of course, and Father Barron's talk, and people like Tim Bush who've started schools themselves. And so I thought just of one word, and that is, think as we leave this conference, to think about avoiding being Pascalian Catholics. I think many of you know Blaise Pascal, who actually had a real tremendous faith in mystical, tradition, but he's known, unfortunately, for his wager. And I think this Pascalian wager sometimes just kills the spirit of Catholics, moves it away from the spirit we've just heard about. He said, a lot of people, maybe just coming to the faith, you should just put it as a wager. If you believe in God and you try to fulfill His will in this lifetime, and then you die, and, you're right, why, you made a great investment. It was a great wager. And if you die, and of course, if you're wrong, you won't know the difference. So how can you lose? But if that's it, and there's no passion, and there's no sense of that value, that the glory of God as a human life come fully alive, if there's no sense of the importance of the transcendent vocation, the dignity we have in it and the eternity of it, then of course it is all for naught. It's just kind of a dead, ongoing faith. In a way, then, I think the 2 presentations we've had today have really exhorted us to that. Well, now, blessed for you, we have a break. Thanks, everyone.